Bulla Felix, Bandit Chief circa 205 to 207 CE. Both the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire were beset by large-scale banditry, which was a prevalent problem. At any given moment, even during the Pax Romana, it is safe to assume that Rome had at least one active latro, or large-scale bandit force, somewhere within its imperial reach. To attract large followings of men, bandit chiefs clearly had to possess a great deal of charisma, and most likely were engaged in some pretty interesting actions. But despite that, very few of them were able to make it into the pages of history. This also applies to pirates. There were many pirate leaders who led what amount to private armadas, and none of their names are really known. The reasons for Roman historians ignoring such men is no doubt partly due to class prejudice, but also it's just the sheer prevalence of banditry. This was a mundane phenomenon. However, there is one great example to this general rule of obscure but important bandit chiefs, and that exception is Bulla Felix. Bulla Felix may just happen to have been the most famous bandit in all of Roman history, or, as we'll see, perhaps he was merely the literary invention of the Roman historian Cassius Dio, who wrote approximately 3/4 of a century after Bulla Felix would have lived and died. We will first look at the issue of Bulla Felix's historicity, and then examine his deeds, whether they be fictional or fact, not being all that important since it does make for a good story either way. When it comes to the historicity of Bulla Felix, some scholars, most notably a German scholar who wrote a lengthy work on Roman banditry, have come to the conclusion that Bulla Felix must be a composite figure or a straight-out literary invention of Cassius Dio. That is certainly a viable position, and I think if I had to put money on it, I would be very hesitant as to what to do with my money. I think there's also a fairly strong case to be made that Bulla Felix was completely historical, but that Cassius Dio did alter or embellish his story in some ways in order to make it meet his literary themes. That would be my position. There are other people who probably would just say, just read Cassius Dio as is, and Bulla Felix is exactly as he's described. I don't know exactly the full range of opinions on Bulla Felix because not that many people study him, to be quite frank. So, just to flesh out this issue more and show you the complexity involved, the Roman world, as we discussed earlier, produced many bandits and therefore bandit chiefs, and in order to attract a large following and retain it for a long amount of time, you would need to possess a good deal of charisma, and you would also have to be quite competent to continue to make sure that your men are fed, paid, and materially provided for. Of course, you would also have to resist against Roman and local officials who would lead troops against you or try to undermine your operation through intelligence gathering and other means. Cassius Dio, just like almost all ancient historians, was at heart a moralist who thought of himself probably as a philosopher to some extent or other. And it is possible that he straight out invented Bulla Felix in order to make a case to elite leaders of his own day that they need to be aware of, or perhaps afraid of, or at least sympathetic to the suffering of the lower class. There was an idea of noblesse oblige, that being that while it is the birthright of the rich and noble to rule, they also had a responsibility to rule well. This was a part of Stoicism. For Cassius Dio, he knew that it was all too common for aristocratic leaders to simply dismiss commoners as the mob and to think of them as beneath contempt and treat them accordingly. So, by outlining a leader like Bulla Felix who comes across as noble, and then by showing Romans dealing with Bulla Felix who come off as either dumb or cruel, what he does is he throws a little bit of complexity into the equation. It's not just moral Roman elite good, bandit bad. So, that is not necessarily something that requires Bulla Felix to be fictional, but a fictional character might do well. And if we think of him as a possible composite figure, perhaps Cassius Dio gathered a few anecdotes from random bandit chiefs and then combined them all into one grand figure of Bulla Felix. That is also an option. But I personally think that Bulla Felix was more of an embellished version of a real person. As for the name Bulla Felix, this has also been cited as evidence for him being an invention. His name translates into English as something like lucky amulet, and one scholar at least has suggested that this could be a kind of spoof of Sulla Felix, after the famous leader of the late Roman Republic. However, given that the name implies that the man owned or in some ways was a lucky amulet, I don't think there's too much to be had with the name itself. It couldn't have been that rare for a leader to produce an emblem that he claimed was lucky or blessed by the gods. And for a leader to claim luck was hardly uncommon, and that is something that would inspire men to follow someone, since luck ultimately derived from the favor of the gods. So that, as a piece of evidence, I think does not stand, but feel free to draw your own conclusions. And as we continue to mull over this issue of historicity, let's take a look at exactly what Cassius Dio had to say about Bulla Felix and all of his deeds. I will take this moment to just point out that Cassius Dio is the only source that we have who mentions Bulla Felix, and perhaps that kind of does argue in favor of Bulla Felix being either greatly exaggerated or invented. If Bulla Felix is historical, what was it like to be a bandit chief in the Roman Empire? Apparently life wasn't that bad if you were a bandit chief who knew how to keep things on the down low. Rome had a pretty minimal approach to governance for the most part, and while local cities did have their own militias, these militias rarely deployed beyond the city walls. When they did deploy and try to hunt down bandits, they often met with embarrassing disasters. For the most part, bandits could therefore operate with impunity in the countryside so long as they didn't attract too much attention. The only way that they would be extirpated is when local officials would complain to Rome sufficiently that Rome would respond in order to keep the local aristocrats happy and to make sure that the locals were able to pay their taxes on time. So Rome's approach, even in Italy, which you would think they would govern a little bit more carefully than the provinces, was to wait until the problem started to impact commerce and cause large-scale complaints, and then send out small campaigns of soldiers under junior officers to clean out bandits, and they would do this on an irregular, as-needed basis. Most likely, to defend this practice to some extent, this was cheaper than doing regular patrols. Rome was, if nothing else, cheap. In Latin, the term latro, or the plural being latrones, was used for groups of bandits numbering 80 or more. This is something that the imperial bureaucracy kept track of, and most likely it was the historians and bureaucrats of the imperial period who invented this term. This shows that this was a very well-known phenomenon, and therefore if you were a bandit, perhaps you dreamt one day of becoming a bandit chief so that you could really reap the rewards of your line of work. If Bulla Felix is in fact real, then he was an Italian man who led a band of about 600 men. Presumably this 600 only counts the men who were robbing people along the Appian Way and did not count all of the various informants and other people that he had working for him in other capacities. However, Cassius Dio does not go into a detailed breakdown of his organization. If Cassius Dio's account of Bulla Felix's operation is accurate, then this was quite a sophisticated and effective arrangement that he had going. Bulla Felix not only had his 600 bandits, but he also had informants all along the Appian Way stretching from Rome to Brundisium, who would keep him informed about all of the men and supplies moving along this key road. His informants let Bulla know about all of the great men leaving Rome who might be loaded down with coin, and all of the various riches and trade goods which were arriving at Brundisium from Rome's eastern half, which was, even at this time, already the more prosperous half of the empire. A lot of the western ports would bring in things like grain imports from northern Africa, whereas Brundisium would bring in more luxury items, so it was a more tempting target for someone whose job was to get rich fast. Bulla was also supposedly able to attract a large number of imperial freedmen. These were the men who had been slaves but were freed on the condition that they remained in the imperial household and helped to keep the records and effectively run what we think of as the Roman bureaucracy. Roman bureaucracy at this time was effectively the emperor's household, and he ran the empire as if it were his extended household. However, Septimius Severus was someone who famously said that a ruler only need concern himself with keeping the soldiers happy and to hell with everyone else, whether those people be senators, the people, or his own bureaucracy and civil servants. Apparently there was a great deal of unrest among his civil servants, and some of them decided to leave Rome and join up with Bulla Felix. This meant that he would have had access to a lot of skilled and talented men who knew about Rome's affairs and had a good idea of how Rome would respond to any given provocation. So this, if true, would explain quite a bit about how Bulla Felix operated and would make some of his ruses seem a little bit more calculated than just straight up bold, the way that I think most readers would take them. One thing about Bulla Felix that has made him appealing to readers of Cassius Dio's history is that he was hardly a cutthroat, even if he was a criminal. As a general rule, Bulla Felix and his men primarily targeted well-off travelers, and even when they would capture someone who was loaded down with coin or valuable goods, they never deprived them of all of those goods or money, but rather would just take a share and then send the person on their merry way. Sometimes, of course, they would capture artisans and men of humble means, but if that were the case, what the bandits would do was to utilize that man's special skills and then release him with a gift for his services, so that he might actually end up better off for having been captured by Bulla Felix. So, Bulla Felix and his merry men were clearly criminals by any reasonable standard. They were acting against the law, but they seem to have cultivated a reasonably strong relationship with the people of Italy, who seem to have largely cooperated with them, and certainly bore them no real ill will, since Bulla Felix and his men were fairly careful not to unnecessarily enrage them. This will come in handy later when Roman officials are hunting for Bulla Felix, since the locals will not be terribly cooperative or all that desperate to see Bulla Felix brought to justice. Bulla Felix is someone who seems to have been quite clever. At some point, 2 of Bulla's men were captured by the Romans, and they were sentenced to be fed to wild beasts. However, Bulla arrived on the scene as a local Italian official and said that he was looking for 2 men matching their description, thus securing their freedom on the premise that he was taking them away for punishment elsewhere. Now, the story is somewhat implausible, since it wouldn't really make much sense to spare these men from execution to take them elsewhere and execute them, but it is not altogether impossible, since aristocrats often had connections with their peers in nearby cities, but the sheer number of municipal officials and the turnover from year to year in various cities means that it would be unlikely that the officials of the city where these men were about to be executed would know all of the officials by sight from the city that Bulla was claiming to be from. So if Bulla were able to pull this off and able to make a convincing story, then it's quite possible that these men were turned over to him in order to try to curry favor with the city he claimed to represent. That being said, we also learn something else about Bulla if this anecdote is in fact true, and that is that Bulla must have been relatively well educated. That's not to say that he was someone of the literary class, but he must have had a pretty decent vocabulary to go along with his charisma, since even a highly charismatic artisan would not be able to convince a Roman aristocrat that he was one of their number. This means that Bulla must have had quite impeccable Latin, and that he must have been able to wear the toga correctly. Most lower class Romans would not have had togas of this kind, so he would have come dressed in his full regalia and looked and talked the part. This also, of course, could be evidence that this anecdote is fictional, since most bandit chiefs who had that kind of social stature would most likely not turn to banditry. On another occasion, Bulla Felix and his band had inspired the ire of Rome sufficiently that there was a centurion coming after him with 100 armed men. To evade this force, Bulla Felix once again turned to his wiles. Claiming to be a common follower of himself, Bulla then pledged in exchange for his own personal safety to lead the centurion to this band and grant him victory over them by taking them by surprise. As he led the centurion to his merry men, Bulla convinced the centurion that they had to enter a defile in order to reach the location where the bandits were hiding out. When Bulla and the centurion passed through this area, his men were waiting in ambush, and they managed to capture the centurions, presumably also with the other men who were in his unit. This, of course, would be quite humiliating for the centurion, and quite a coup for Bulla Felix, who clearly was a better master of disguise than Mike Myers. Bulla appeared on a tribunal as he addressed his captives, and he told the Roman centurion to deliver a message to his leaders back in Rome. Feed your slaves so that they may not turn to brigandage. The point of this is clearly that the Romans had only themselves to blame for the existence of a man like Bulla Felix. Had they merely fed their people sufficiently and made sure that poverty didn't get too out of hand, this would not be happening right now. Of course, for people who think that this is a made-up story, this once again serves as evidence that Cassius Dio was playing moral historian and trying to convey a message to his readers. But it's not at all impossible. Perhaps Bulla Felix was someone who was relatively well off at one point, but then fell on hard times and used his combination of charisma and speaking ability to make himself a leader of bandits because he had no real choice. If Bulla Felix primarily flourished between 205 and 207, this means that his entire operation fell within the reign of Septimius Severus, one of the harshest soldier emperors that Rome ever produced. At the time of Bulla's peak, Severus was away in Britain. However, the antics of Bulla Felix and the little theatrical display that he put on for the centurion managed to pique the interest of Septimius Severus. Severus was quite enraged when he learned about how the Romans in Italy were being humiliated by a mere bandit chief, while he was off winning real victories for the empire in Britain. Summoning one of his military tribunes, Severus ordered him to lead a detachment back home in order to hunt down and kill the bandit leader. Severus was quite specific that the man was to kill the bandit leader and not capture him or in any way pardon him. Severus went so far as to tell this nameless tribune that his very life depended on the success of his operation, giving this tribune as much of a motive as one would need to hunt down bandits. One of the reasons why some scholars think that Bulla Felix was a complete invention is that there is a famous anecdote from the time of Augustus where he captured a Spanish bandit and then showed clemency to the man. This is supposed to contrast the gentle governance of Augustus, who tried to rule largely by consensus, with the straight-up military dictatorship of Septimius Severus. Now, while you can clearly argue from a modern perspective that Augustus was a military dictator, he was a fairly lax one in many ways. He rarely resorted to force when diplomacy would do. For Septimius Severus, however, force was his first resort. And this goes along with what I have been arguing, that there was a Bulla Felix, but that his story has been catered and embellished to fit the themes of Cassius Dio's narrative, rather than simply invented out of whole cloth. When this nameless tribune arrived back in Italy, he took with him a small detachment of cavalry from Britain. It's worth noting that forces that served Rome in the field on the frontiers by this period were of such vastly superior quality when compared to the local militias that even this small force would have been quite devastating if it could meet Bulla in battle. However, first this tribune would have to find Bulla Felix. So his first task was to begin gathering information about Bulla by interviewing locals. This presumes that earlier officials hadn't tried this, which is not terribly hard to believe if these guys were as bumbling as Severus seems to have considered them. Eventually, the Tribune learned that Bulla was having an affair with another man's wife. So, the Tribune was able to convince this couple to provide assistance to his efforts in exchange for immunity from the consequences of helping a bandit. The cooperation of this couple led to the arrest of Bulla Felix, who was sleeping in a cave at the time of his capture. The unnamed tribune then turned the chief over to Papinian, a prefect, presumably the prefect of Rome, or perhaps this is a mistake in Cassius's narrative and he actually meant to say praetor, since praetors typically handled judicial affairs. At any rate, it appears that Bulla Felix, for all of his charm and cleverness, is someone who couldn't quite resist the temptation of a good old-fashioned honeypot. Bulla Felix's last words were among his most famous. When the prefect Papinian asked Bulla why he had become a robber in the first place, the bandit chief replied, "Why are you a prefect?" The obvious implication here being that Papinian was just a bandit chief who operated on a larger scale and with the official support of Rome behind him. This was something of a literary trope. There are several other instances in Roman literature where a captured leader will make a similar remark to his captor. This passage in Cassius Dio is perhaps the linchpin of the argument that the story was invented for moralistic purposes. However, I would argue once again that this is more likely to represent a story being tailored to the themes of Cassius's narrative, and also that this could simply reflect a slight retooling to make the story a little more familiar to audiences that had read other accounts where other captured leaders had made a similar remark to their captors. Papinian, predictably, on Severus's explicit orders, sentenced Bulla Felix to death by a wild beast, a fate that he had successfully saved a few of his men from earlier. The authority and charisma of Bulla Felix had been such that it was the glue which held the band together. And without him, despite its organization and all of the people involved along the Appian Way, the ring quickly dissolved, and it proved to be a case where cutting off the head of the snake was enough to cause the entire house of cards to collapse. Perhaps the Roman officials knew exactly what they were doing, and this was all too typical of their dealings with previous large forces of bandits. At any rate, while Bulla Felix may or may not have been historical, he still tells us a pretty good deal about how bandits operated and about the central significance of having one key figure that all of the bandits could rally around. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I'll be back with yet more Romans of renown at some point in the future.